have the victory in Him. So stand with me, 587. We'll sing the first and last verse of Victory in Jesus.
Good evening. I know I wasn't the person you were expecting up here this evening. Pastor Treg is out of the hospital, and he's still pretty rough, though. So continue to keep him in your prayers. We'll make sure we add him to the prayer list. Okay, just making sure I'm on. So instead, you have to put up with me for another week. Judges chapter 6. This is probably a story you might already know. If you know me and you've been around me for very long, I like to study the people of the Bible. I've always liked to study the people of the Bible. I recently did a study of some of the people out of Acts. I've been doing a little bit of a study of some of the judges, so we're going to study some of what I've been studying. How's that? This evening. So we're going to start with a gentleman you probably have heard of before. His name is Gideon. So we're going to study Gideon for just a little while. Gideon is kind of an interesting individual. I have always liked the study of Gideon that I have done in the past. Gideon is so weird. He's a contrast. He's a study in contrast. Maybe I should use that word study again. He's a study in contrast. He led an army of warriors against an incredibly larger army and won an amazing victory, which is saying something considering his few men that were in his army as opposed to the army that he was fighting against, the Midianites specifically. But when we first get to see Gideon, he really is just kind of, he's kind of a coward. He's hiding. He doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to get involved if given that choice. And most of the time when we think of Gideon, we think of the Gideon that is the man who's leading the army. We don't think of the Gideon as the man who is hiding behind the winepress. Gideon is also a man who questioned God's will. He questioned God's plan. He didn't think that it was worthwhile or that it would work, but in the end, he was a man who did God's will. Gideon was a judge, if you remember the Judges. Do you remember the progression in the book of Judges? All right, let's start with people sinned. People sinned. God sent somebody to oppress them, some judgment upon them. People, not yet. We'll get there in a minute. People cried out to the Lord for help. God sent them a judge. Do you remember this? This is where you shake your heads yes or no. You say yes or no. You give me some indication that you remember what we're talking about here in the book of Judges. People sinned. They get oppressed. God sends them a judge. Judge saves them from their oppression. People repent. Judge dies. People forget. People sin. God sends oppression. We can just keep going around and around in this circle. You get that, right? Okay. This is a big circle. It's a big cycle in the book of Judges. He is a judge. He is someone who is sent by God to take care of the oppression so that the people will come back to God. And in this case, the oppression was the Midianites. The people were watching as their lands were stripped, their homes, their villages were destroyed, their stuff was taken, their lives were endangered. In verse 6, if you go with me to chapter 6, verse 6, it says, Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. That word impoverished gives you the idea that they were at the end of their rope. They were about down to as little as they could make it. And then we see coming on the scene this judge. The judge here being our good friend Gideon. And he is a mighty man of valor. Verse 4 of this chapter. No, I have that written down wrong. Verse 4. Oh, no, yeah, here it is. And they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth, till thou come into Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude. For both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. And it came to pass, when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord because of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, which said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you forth out of the house of bondage, and I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and the hand of all that oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you their land. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God, not the gods of the Amorites, in whose lands ye dwell, but ye have not obeyed my voice. And there came an angel of the Lord, and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained to Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So we see Gideon, we see really the circumstances that he was under. The Midianites had come in and destroyed everything and taken everything, and they were hard to fight against. It says they were as grasshoppers in the land. I mean, everywhere you went, there they were. And you see Gideon. And what is Gideon doing? Oh, yeah, he's hiding. It says, Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. What is Gideon doing? He's threshing wheat behind a winepress. Now, how much do you know about threshing wheat? You guys ever done it by hand? Anybody in here ever threshed wheat? I've watched enough videos of it. We used to, my grandfather you probably heard me tell this story before if you've been in my Sunday school class. My grandfather used to plant winter wheat. Any of you ever done this? You know, talking about? Okay, my grandfather was a farmer. My dad's dad was a farmer, and he planted winter wheat. And the boys, kids who were his grandchildren, would go by and we would grab the wheat and we would take it off in our hands so that we would have the actual wheat kernels in our hands. Any of you, nobody's done this but me. A few, yeah? Okay, and we rub it in our hands like this, and we blow the chaff off of it. Shake it a little, blow the chaff off of it again, pop it in your mouth. It's actually pretty good to eat. It is. It's just kernels of wheat. They're almost like nuts. They really are pretty good to eat. I highly suggest it if you're ever in a position to try it out, that you try this out. But the first thing you've got to do, don't just pull the wheat off the stalk and pop it in your mouth, because you will not like that. The first thing you got to do if you're going to be doing that with wheat is why do you do that? You got to get the chaff off the wheat, because the chaff is nasty to try to eat. It's really hard to try to eat. So Gideon here, he is threshing wheat, which I did it kind of as a small version, and then I blew the chaff off, because the chaff is really, really light. And if you knew how they did threshing wheat back in those days, they would bring it into these barns that they had almost a tunnel, a wind tunnel in them, and they would beat it on the ground, the wheat on the ground, until they got all the kernels off the wheat, and then they would throw it up in the air as the wind at the right time of the day is passing through that barn, and it would blow the chaff out of the wheat. This was really important because you didn't want to eat the wheat with the chaff. Let me tell you something, though. If you're behind the wine press, beating wheat on the ground, you're not going to have a threshing floor. You're not going to have a barn. You're not going to have anything to be able to get the wheat and make it worthwhile. You're going to end up eating wheat mixed in with or chaff mixed in with your wheat. The only reason I can think of why a person would ever consider hiding behind a wine press to thresh their wheat would be they were hungry and they didn't really have a whole lot of other choice. They couldn't go to the places, the threshing floors, where they could actually properly thresh the wheat. So he's here in the wine press, behind this wine press, threshing the wheat because he doesn't want to get out. And he really couldn't have had very much grain to work with, or this wouldn't have worked for him very well at all. We get the idea that perhaps the Midianites had come along and taken about everything else. And all he had was a little bit of grain left, and he was afraid that was going to get taken too. So he went and hid to be able to do this. Now, I mean, we live in difficult times. We don't live in that difficult a time. But we do live in times where our society is kind of hostile to us. And we see less and less people standing for the Lord. And honestly, we see a lot of people who are hiding behind the wine press. Yeah, so Gideon's day is kind of like today. And what happens next? And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all the miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. So the mighty man of valor. Does Gideon seem to you like a mighty man of valor at this point in time? When you think of a mighty man of valor, that terminology, when you think of a mighty man of valor, how many of you think of some guy who's so scared of someone else that he has to go hide behind the local wine press and thresh his wheat for fear of it getting taken away from him? That's not normally what we would think of as mighty man of valor. But this angel of the Lord appears to him, and the angel of the Lord is a theophany in this case. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This is a theophany, and I know that because Gideon later on, and just for sake of time, we're not going to read it, but Gideon worships this angel of the Lord. And what happens when you worship an angel? The angels always tell you, if you remember in Revelation chapter 22, John tries to worship an angel. The angel says, don't worship me, worship God. Daniel tries to worship an angel, and the angel says, don't worship me, worship God. Gideon worships the angel, and the angel is okay with it. The only way the angel would be okay with it is if the angel is a theophany, that is, the angel is someone who is to be worshipped. God had these plans. He knew where Gideon was, and he was planning for Gideon's future. And I have always found this, we're going to talk about the mighty man of valor, but isn't it interesting to you that God here doesn't see the Gideon that we see? Because when we look at Gideon, we would say, mighty man of valor. No, that is not the guy you're describing here. But Gideon is called a mighty man of valor. He immediately gets into an argument with the angel about whether or not, he doesn't actually argue about whether or not that's true, but he does argue whether or not the Lord's with him. He doesn't see himself as a mighty man of valor, but God sees him as a mighty man of valor. And I've always found that to be a great point, that God sees what our potential is. God sees what we can be with his help. God sees what he can make us into. God doesn't see what seems obvious to the rest of us. And I can use my own life as an example. If you knew me, I was the kid who would never get up in front of everybody. Any of the rest of you like that? Snow teaching, you did not like getting up in front of people in class. Okay, I got a few people who are willing to admit, hey, when I was in school and we had to do a presentation in front of the class, that was like the worst thing in the world. I could not stand doing that. Do not like to get up in front of people. Yeah, I was that person too. I just, nope. No, what's the lowest grade that you will give me for me not to do this? Or the highest grade you will give me for me not to do this. I am willing to take that grade. Yeah, I did not like that. But obviously I'm standing up in front of you this evening, and the Lord had other plans. I mean, God knew and God planned. I mean, this guy, though, is called a mighty man of valor. He's a coward. He's hiding behind a wine press threshing wheat. But God knew what Gideon could do. God trusted him, and really, Gideon may have looked like a weakling, but God saw a warrior. Verse 13. Let me reread that. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? If God is here, shouldn't we be winning? I mean, you tell me God is here, but why is this all happened? And where are all the miracles? Where be all the miracles which our fathers told us of saying? So where have all the miracles gone? This is his argument. Does this remind you of anybody else? Those of you who have studied the Bible, does this remind you of anyone else? Moses. Do you remember Moses as the burning bush? Okay, come on. Do you remember that there was this guy named Moses? All right. With a lot of you, I try to talk to you, and it's just like, Moses, burning bush. What happened to the burning bush? God said to Moses, I want you to go to Egypt. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Hey, you picked up on the song very well. Thank you. And Moses said, I can't do it. I can't talk. I gave all these other excuses for it. The same kind of thing comes here out of Gideon. Gideon's like, yeah, no, that's that. If the Lord's actually with us, then if God's actually here, then why are the people in this situation? And honestly, where have all the miracles gone? And finally, in verse 14 and 15, and he looked upon him and said, go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And he, that is Gideon, said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Me? Save Israel? No, I don't think that's a good idea. Yeah, no. Me save Israel? Behold, my family's poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. It's Israel, and you're going to save Israel, and Gideon says basically, yeah, I don't think that's right. My house is poor, which means that no one outside our house really respects the house itself. And honestly, inside of our house, I'm like the bottom rung here. Not only is our house not really respected, but I'm not even really respected in my own house. I'm the bottom of that. Gideon's dad, as we know, if you read in verse 25, Gideon's dad was an idolater. And maybe the fact that Gideon still worshiped the Lord made him an outcast in his own house. But regardless, his excuse here is basically, I can't save Israel because nobody respects my house, and even inside of my house, nobody respects me. My own family doesn't really think very much of me here. So I really can't do this. And again, he's focusing on himself. He's not focusing on God. He's not focusing on what God can do with him. He is focusing on what he thinks of himself. I mean, really, God works with people that we wouldn't have expected. It's something that is a theme throughout the scriptures. You think about Abraham, he was from Ur. You think about Jacob, that man was a charlatan and a liar. He was a cheat. Joseph was a slave. Moses was a shepherd on the backside of the desert, and before that he had to run from Egypt because he'd killed somebody. If you remember, Jephthah, who was another one of these judges, was the son of a prostitute. How about Naaman? You remember Naaman? Who was the person in Naaman's life that really got Naaman on the right path? Anybody know her name? She's called a servant girl. And no one even, the Bible doesn't even name her for us. Esther, No parents. You go to the New Testament, what about Matthew? He was a publican. I don't know if you realize what a publican is, but publicans were tax collectors. They were kind of the bottom barrel of their day. They did not even like tax collectors in their day. Paying taxes is something we don't like in ours either. So, I mean, really. But he gets confirmed. Gideon is going to get confirmed here by this angel. And he said unto him, verse 17, and he said unto him, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. Gideon's going to be big on these signs. Well, he is. We know Gideon for the trumpets and the pitchers, but the other thing we know Gideon for is the fleece. Depart not hence, I pray thee, until I come unto thee and bring forth my present and set it before thee. And he said, I will tarry until thou come again. And Gideon went in and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour, and the flesh he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought it out unto him under the oak, and presented it. And the angel of God said unto him, take the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and lay them upon the rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand, and toucheth the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and there rose up a fire out of the rock, and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. He disappeared. So Gideon here was confirmed by this sacrifice, by this presentation. The angel of the Lord agrees to wait until Gideon returns. Gideon places this sacrifice that he makes on a rock, and fire comes out of the rock, consuming the sacrifice, proving to Gideon that this was not just an angel, by the way. This was the Lord, and that the Lord had in fact called him. Now, we ourselves are called as a sacrifice. We're not called as a burnt sacrifice, though, but we are called as a living sacrifice. Our sacrifice is ourselves, our own lives. We're called as that sacrifice just as Gideon was called for a sacrifice. He was confirmed here by this sacrifice, and we would be confirmed in that sacrifice as well. If you read on in verse 22, and when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for because I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said unto him, peace be unto thee, fear not, thou shalt not die. Then Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord, and called it Jehovah Shalom unto this day. It is yet in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So he is confirmed by this promise. Gideon thought this, I'm not sure whether Gideon thought this was serious. I'm not sure whether do you think Gideon actually thought this sacrifice was going to go down that way? All right, let me ask that question again. When Gideon said to the angel, I'm going to go inside, I'm going to make a meal, I'm going to bring it out to you, you stay here. And the angel said, I'll stay here. Gideon went inside, he took the time to make the different amounts of food. He brings it out. If you were to have someone come to your house and talk to you, and you made them dinner, you with me? Which is a big deal. You don't think about the fact that they're in the middle of this whole thing where the Midianites had taken all their stuff, right? So for them to sacrifice this was a real sacrifice. Okay. Gideon makes all this stuff, brings the dinner out to the angel, and he presents it to the angel. And what does the angel say? Put it on the rock. Now, let me ask you a question. If you made a meal for someone who came to your house, would you expect them, when you brought it out to them, because they're still standing outside, to say, go put it on the rock? And not only would you not expect them to say, go put it on the rock, you probably wouldn't expect them to tap the rock with the staff that's in their hand and the whole meal that you just spent all this time making burn up. So it really was a burnt sacrifice. If you remember the burnt sacrifices in the Old Testament, the sacrifices were made in such a way that most of the sacrifices were given to the priests. But the burnt sacrifice was a sacrifice directly to God, and you knew that because they burnt it. You burn it till it was ash and there was nothing left, so no one could use any part of it. It was a sacrifice given to God. You couldn't get it back even if you wanted to with a burnt sacrifice. This was that same kind of burnt sacrifice. Do you think that Gideon thought this was going to go down this way? I don't think he thought that. When he walked out there with the meal, the boiled meat and the cakes, and he presented it to the angel, and the angel said, go put it on the rock, and he's like, okay, I'm not sure what that's about. Let's put the cakes on the rock, put the meat on that, pour the liquid over the top of it, step back, and it goes up in flame. I can guarantee you that is not what he thought was going to happen to that food. What he thought was going to happen to that food was that the angel was going to eat it. And whether or not he had realized that it was an angel at that point in time, I don't even think he'd realized it was an angel yet. But he certainly did after the sacrifice was burned up. I mean, he realized exactly who he was dealing with, and he cries out because no man can look upon the face of the Lord and live. And he's thinking to himself, I just saw the Lord, I am going to die because I can't look upon the Lord and live. He's worried for his life, and in fact, the Lord gives him peace and says, Gideon, I have a plan for you. You still haven't carried out that plan. You are not going to die. And of course, we know that plan is that he is going to save the people from the Midianites. And it's got a kind of an interesting way of doing it, but we know that that plan is to save the people from the Midianites. So he promises Gideon, Gideon, you are not going to die. And Gideon builds an altar, and we can see what Gideon thinks about this situation in the name he gives the altar. He builds this altar. It says in verse 24, and Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom. The Lord is peace. That is the Lord our peace. God gave him peace there. And while he still does his questions, and while he still has his situation of not being sure about what's going on with fighting the people and preparing for battle, Gideon here at this point in time has presented that sacrifice, and he has agreed to what the Lord has told him to do. And we see that he's going to do that. I mean, Gideon, when we first saw him, really did not seem like he was the best choice for saving Israel. But as I said, God looks on not what we see, but God looks on what he sees. And sometimes God has plans for us, and we say, Lord, I can't do that. No, Lord, I can't. It's not just that I won't, because a lot of times we think we really do believe to ourselves, Lord, I can't. I can't do that. No, I can't. But the reality is, if God asks us to do something, if God tells us to do something, God also is going to provide us with the ability to do that thing. Because the reality is, Gideon couldn't have defeated the Midianites. He didn't have nearly a big enough army to be able to defeat the Midianites. He had no way of one-on-one by himself with swords to go after the Midianites. They were like grasshoppers. He could not get an army big enough together to make that work. So God instead comes up with a plan for him and tells him what to do. God had a plan, and he obeyed the plan that God gave him. He couldn't have done it himself. There was no way to make that work. But with God, it could work. And in the same way with us, if we will follow God's plan, he will not just tell us to go do something that we can't do, but he will give us that ability to do it. If we rely on God, he'll make us not just what we think we can be, but he will make us what he knows we can be. Any questions, comments? All right, let's take prayer requests. Pray for Pastor Tragg. And hang on, I got another text. Fred is in New York at his sister's funeral, so pray for Fred as well. Do I need to repeat that? Yes, I believe. I've not heard anything. I know he was in the hospital. Is he out? Ray Whitmer.
Yeah, he's home.
He's home?
He came home the same day.
All right, that's good. He's home. Any other prayer requests? Yes, ma'am.
I got several. First of all, my brother, Pastor Ed Woods, is in the Pittsburgh Hospital right now. They're not sure what's going on, but his blood vessels to his brain are being constricted. So he's got a pretty serious situation there. My sister, Donna, she's got some health issues with her. She has psoriatic arthritis, and she had to go off her medication because they said her TB test came back positive.
Oh, that's weird.
So they had to deal with that. And then my oldest daughter has a bad cold.
We have, on the note of the cold, just because that just reminded me of it, we have a lot of people at MCA, particularly in high school right now, who are sick. If you could just pray for MCA and the number of people who are sick. All right, so Pastor Ed Woods, he is in Pittsburgh Hospital. He has a constriction of the blood vessels to his vasculitis. Her sister Donna has arthritis, and they've had to take her off her meds because she had a positive TB test.
When you took her off her meds and they did a TB test, and her immune system was so low, it became positive.
All right. And then her oldest daughter's got a cold. And then pray for the people at MCA who are sick. Kim?
Carol Sign asked for prayer again.
Pray for Carol Sign.
She's got an upcoming shoulder and back appointment. And then I've had the opportunity to witness to some people lately, just that God will stir their hearts.
And Kim's friends that she's been witnessing to.
Benny has a extremely bad sinus infection.
Ooh.
He's on an antibiotic and taking on.
Yeah, sinus infections are hard to get rid of. And Kim knows that. She had one that she had to have 4 or 5 or 6 different rounds. That's, for those, my wife is up in the sound room. Pray for Pastor Moran. He's got a sinus infection. Yes, ma'am.
Just a way to pray for Trey. Of course, he's in there with
He's got a long way to go.
So it's a good thing kind of in a way because he never was established with a GI doctor here in town because he was in North Carolina. So he's not been treating it anyway, but with his diet, which has not been enough with everything. So this, I think, will give him a plan. He goes back in a couple weeks for a colonoscopy after the infection's gone. And they said, Craig said, well, I took Liata and stuff 8 years ago. And he said, we've come a long way in 8 years. We can really help you. So that would be huge if they could really just, he's not felt well since before his heart attack. He's not had a good week in I don't know how many months.
So pray for Pastor Treg. Colitis, he's got an abscess, in a lot of pain, and his meds aren't supposed to kick in until Saturday. Whew. And hopefully the doctors can figure out something to do to help him in the long run. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. The family is affected by the shutdown. Yes.
With that being said, my brother and his fiance definitely with the shutdown. He works for a federal contract, but he was told that if this doesn't get resolved, they'll be removed as well.
Brother and fiance, this shutdown needs to be fixed so that he doesn't basically lose his job. Anybody else? Well, if that's it, you can share more prayer requests in your own prayer groups if we want to break up into our prayer groups. If you have any other questions, any other